Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Dutiful Future podcast. Diving straight in, I am today joined by my wonderful colleague, India Bourke, at India_Bourke on Twitter, who is the environment correspondent at the New Statesman. And today we are discussing the cheery topic of climate change, specifically water and sewage. Things that are so much fun. You know, water, you love it, you need it, and worryingly, you're getting a lot less of it recently. India, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
You've recently written 3 amazing articles on the New Statesman, the links for which will be in the description, on the issues of heat waves, water, droughts, and what we'll be starting with sewage. So if you wouldn't mind just right off the bat, for people who aren't very familiar with such topics, of just giving a very just an introduction to what is the situation right now, and how serious is it? You know, how serious is the shitstorm that we might be facing in tragically literal terms?
It is basically a shit, which is kind of sums it all up, really. But to explain what happened with the sewage most recently, I think it was the beginning of last week, the heavens opened after we'd had a really long dry period in the UK, almost unprecedentedly long, with very little or no rain. And so the ground was incredibly hard, like cracks were appearing if you went out into parks or farmland. And then when the rains finally arrived en masse, around last weekend, last Monday, instead of soaking into the ground, which is what you want to happen, so that the water table underneath the ground can be replenished, that didn't happen. It just kind of swept off the top. Kind of mini flash floods we had in North London, definitely on my street. And the problem then is that it all goes pouring into the drains and sewers. And the water companies, because they're very concerned that if there's too much water too quickly, the system can't handle it, and you risk the sewage backing up into people's homes, which they don't want. So they do have permits from the government to, in times of absolute need, release the sewage straight out into rivers and seas without being treated and cleaned up.
Wow.
And so that's what happened, and it's what frequently happens, and it sometimes happens even when it's not raining, which is what people are rightly very angry about.
Yeah, that is a fantastic summary. So I feel like, so when people hear oh, sewage is getting dumped in the sea, right, there's very obvious reasons why that's bad. Sewage is bad, we don't want it in water. But if you wouldn't mind giving a little bit of detail or a sort of broader analysis on what are the consequences of sewage being in river water and seawater, apart from just the fact that it's terrible. In my mind, it's a Simpsons style fish with 100 different eyes. I'm sure you have much better things to contribute.
I've never heard that phrase before.
It's a new one.
Useful. So yeah, there's the human side and then there's the environmental side, which are obviously all mixed together. But to start with us, essentially it's just ghastly if you want to go down to the beach to swim or whatever, and you do genuinely risk your health if you do so, if there's been a recent sewage release, wastewater release. I think the government has said that there was 153 reports of related sickness in 2020 alone, that were linked to places where sewage had been released and people were exposed to it. So it's toxic stuff. The surfers, if you want to make sure when you next go to the beach that it is safe to swim, I highly recommend checking out the Surfers Against Sewage app, which has a map which lights up with little red flags all the way along the coast where when sewage has been released. And I think just after the big rain last week, within 24 hours, the charity told me that I think there'd been 30 releases, and that just continued to exponentially grow over the next few days as well. So the whole coastline was kind of a sea of red flags by the end of it, which was pretty depressing. So that's the human side, and obviously also it's also released into rivers. So same problem if you want to go wild swimming. And then the environmental and the nature side is just so grim and depressing. Like the stat you have to remember is that only 14% of British rivers are in good condition. It might be English and Welsh rivers only. I'm not sure if it includes Scotland. I think it does, but you might need to check that.
Fact on screen now.
Sorry.
No.
And it's important to distinguish between England and Wales and Scotland, because Scotland's water companies aren't still in public hands, I believe, whereas England's are privatised. But yeah, the important thing, only 14% of rivers are in good condition, ecological condition. And if you look at somewhere, if you Google Windermere, Lake Windermere in the Lake District, which a really, really famous lake, really popular tourist destination, beautiful lake. It's kind of bright green at the minute because it's just filled with algae. And like you get algae when like water is not healthy. And then it's like a vicious circle where the algae kind of sucks the oxygen out of the water. So fish are like gasping, they can't breathe. And eventually everything just dies off and you just get like dead water. There's far too many places around the UK that are experiencing that at the minute. The River Wye on the Welsh English border is a really, really problematic place. And I should probably also mention that it's not just the water companies that are to blame for these releases, for polluting the rivers. They're a really important part of the jigsaw in terms of polluting rivers and waterways, but farms also, they have a very big part to play as well, like, releasing slurry and sewage and runoff from fertilizer and pesticides from fields and things. So it's the combination is like this chemical soup that obviously, we have some of the most nature deprived like countryside in Europe, and this is like really developing.
Yeah, that is a detailed and grim picture. I think summarizes it really, really well. Yeah, I think shit is the best way to put it in both literal and figurative terms. We can swear as much as we'd like. Other podcasts have opened, literally the first word has been swear words. So another one of our colleagues, Ben Walker, my podcast with him, literally opens it with him telling me to, and I quote, "do my fucking job." So things are great here. So you mentioned about the difference between, so Scotland's water companies are still under the state control, they're still nationalized, whereas England's are privatized. And you also mentioned that so the private water companies currently have permits to, in what is supposed to be dire circumstances, to dump sewage into water. I'm interested in, so we'll get on to potential solutions for these problems and potential moves forward, but I'm curious about how much of a difference nationalization of water companies can play, whether it's in comparison between England and Scotland, or potentially even with other countries you mentioned in your article, like Germany and I think France. Would nationalization actually make a difference in this situation?
I'm not super up on what's happening in Scotland.
No worries.
But I know that pollution is a problem everywhere. I think there's still been sewage releases in Scotland too. But there is a particular problem in England because of privatised water companies, in that, I mean, it's very hard to say, it's hard to like rerun history and go, it would have been better if they hadn't been privatised. I mean, the fact that they have, and we now have to deal with the situation that we have. Ultimately, in terms of performance, like, it's ultimately the government that still sets the regulations for those companies. So, and then is responsible for enforcing them. So if the government hasn't A, set high enough targets, and B, hasn't enforced the targets that it set, you kind of have to go, well, it is ultimately on them, because they do have the power to demand that certain standards are met. And even if they're demanding them, they're not making sure it happens. And then, the privatisation thing is particularly interesting and problematic, in that these companies, they're owned by like private private owners, mostly overseas, and they've been actually loading these companies with debt, and then also giving out at the same time billions of pounds of subsidies to shareholders, which feels like a very strange thing to have done at a time when, you know, the whole water system, and maybe we'll talk about drought and leaks in a minute, and the sewage system is crying out for more investment in infrastructure.
Yeah, I remember the stat that was in your article. I can't remember the time frame, but it was 57 billion was paid out in dividends to shareholders of water companies, whilst we're in one of the most dire states of our water system in a long time.
Yeah, and I think the other thing people are raising a lot is the bonuses that have been paid to water executives. We hear a lot about bankers' bonuses.
Yeah,
people don't so much think about water executives' bonuses, but yeah, millions and millions of pounds every year, and again, they're not really. We've got companies. Some of the companies are, you know, under investigation for failing to meet these standards at the minute. So.
Yeah, I mean, you know, whilst capitalism is failing, there's one thing that you can always be sure, that's the execs are still going to get their bonuses. So that is something that we can all rely on in these dark times.
We're in the wrong industry.
Now we all know that's for certain. What was I going to ask? Please, no one at the New Statesman watch this. Please keep us. We didn't mean it. You mentioned that there's fault on the government for whether it's, you know, having a regulation being too the regulation targets being too low, or whether the enforcement of regulation being too lacking. So we've had something, is it 12 years of a Tory government? Is this like lack of regulation, do you see, is it like a party issue? Is it a Conservatives just not caring enough or not doing enough, or is this something that has been a broader problem in our political system of just a lack of attention to what is now and is increasingly becoming a very serious problem?
I can't remember exactly how the timeline fits together, but I think an important thing to know is that when I was talking to someone about leaks, and so leaky pipes, what you might have seen if you live in London, there's like loads of water in the street all the time at the same time as they're announcing hosepipe bans and things. And the leaks are again due to the infrastructure needing updating, and the water companies will tell you, and they are right, that, you know, this isn't just a UK problem. Pipes are very difficult to maintain. It's an ongoing, it's an ongoing thing. You don't fix them and they're fixed forever kind of thing. And there are lots of problems with leaky pipes in Europe too, across privatized and public ownership. And the UK, you know, they have made progress and they are fixing a lot of the pipes, but they are not fixing enough of the pipe fast enough. And someone did tell me an interesting point, which was that at some point in the past, I think the targets that were set were higher, I think. And they met them, and they were kind of getting faster and better at fixing the leaks. But then the targets more recently have kind of dropped off, perhaps, and then the pace of change has slowed down. So yeah, it does kind of depend who's setting the targets and how they are.
Interesting. I mean, perhaps this is too granular a question, but so the two regulators, it's Ofwat and the Environment Agency. And no worries if this is too specific a question. If Ofwat and the Environment Agency, the two main regulators, have enough power at all to really enforce these issues, regulations on water companies, or is this something where it's just this? If they were given more power, could it make a difference, or is this just a system where having a separate regulator just isn't enough?
I think there's a problem that some people have mentioned to me in having two regulators, in that some issues can fall between the cracks. But ultimately, you know, it's the Minister for Environment who needs to step in, and you know, they have the power, so they just need to use it.
That makes perfect sense.
There's like procedures they have to follow in terms of, you know, doing that, but it just hasn't been done.
So in terms of the political moment we're in, right, there was a big, to use the term again, shitstorm because a while ago, 256 Conservative MPs voted against tougher legislation on water companies, is what was the reported narrative. I've seen there's been some dispute on what the specifics of this meant. However, I'm curious about, is this something where, we're looking at the two Tory candidates right now, Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, who are increasingly, as Andrew Marr said in one of our videos, scared to address issues of climate change. Liz Truss referred to solar panels as one of the almost like not verbatim, but almost like polluting our beautiful farmland. Is this something where just the Conservative Party at the moment just can't offer or aren't offering any sort of solution to these increasingly real problems? Is the only real political action that could happen would be a change in party and change in government leadership?
Well, there's two parts to that. One is that Tory MPs are so scared about this. Like, they really wish this wasn't an issue. It's about like the worst kind of, as Anoush wrote in her very good piece about particularly this amendment that 265 Tory MPs voted down.
Is it 265?
Is it 56 or 65?
Oh no, I'm really scared I got my number wrong. One of us got the number wrong.
Got it wrong. No, it's 200 and...
Who's right is on screen now.
Around 250 MPs.
256 or 265?
Gosh, I'm terrible at remembering numbers in my head, but around that number voted down last year. It was an amendment to the Environment Bill. And what was my point? My point was that, they don't want, it was a gift, Anoush wrote, to kind of opposition parties in their kind of campaigning material, could go, look, your Tory MP voted against cleaning up the shit.
Yeah.
And it's a terrible, terrible thing to have on you in terms of messaging. That said, they did vote it down. They claim they did so because it was kind of badly worded and uncosted, and essentially they said, we can't just automatically solve this. And to a degree that's true, but it's also about a show of kind of willing. And to show that willing, they said, okay, well, they kind of did a small U-turn, and they said, right, well, we promised to publish a plan on how we're gonna sort out these discharges. That was meant to come, I think, in September. They've now said it's going to be delayed. Like, just nothing is getting done right now across the board under the Tory government. So yeah, I feel that kind of sums up.
Yeah, it's one of those classics. Well, we can't do this because it's not practical. We like the idea it's not practical yet, and then they proceed to not do what they might think would be practical. They just kind of reject something and then move on, which is a little bit of a shame, to put it very mildly. So currently, you've done a really good job of establishing what the situation is and how serious it is. I'm curious in terms of how much will this be compounding? Is this something which will gradually become felt more and more, or is this there's a cliff and we're about to fall over it? Because I think it can be quite at least to me personally, like a vague issue to have a literal grasp of. So I'm wondering how what's the timeline almost, not to make any major predictions, but how what's the acceleration of this sort of issue?
Well, the ultimate acceleration of it is what's happening with climate change. Like, the faster the world heats up, and it is kind of, we're feeling the consequences more severely and more quickly than pretty much everyone expected, which is so scary. And it is the warming that creates the drought, that creates the flash floods, that creates a lot of the problem that the underlying infrastructure is not set up to deal with yet. So it's about how fast we can bring down emissions to slow climate change as much as possible, and then B, at the same time, how much we can invest in the infrastructure, whether that's better sewers, better pipes, better reservoirs, and means of kind of holding water in times of drought. So it's those two fronts of action, and they're both about as urgent as they can be.
Well, you mentioned that the climate change is being felt, at least in the UK, more so than we ever have, and very dramatically. There's that photo that went very viral of the map of the UK where the majority of it is, instead of being green, is now yellow because of all the grass dying and drying up. I don't know if you've seen it. just the sheer act of an extremely heat wave was definitely a slap in the face. And I'm interested in terms of, so a few days ago there was a hashtag on Twitter by predominantly right-wing voices called hashtag there is no climate crisis. And it was, normally I think you'd expect this to be like a bunch of random loons, but it was populated by a few GB News pundits, whose names I won't mention because I will just be rude about them. And I'm curious about the level of cognitive dissonance, or at least like climate change has never been so visible and feelable to the average person in the UK. How, why do you think there is still such a determined group of people who just refuse to acknowledge what is literally all around them?
I haven't seen the hashtag, so I can't specifically
just
answer
in general.
In a general way, yeah, it's just so depressing when you look at the Tory leadership race, and you would almost think that the circumstances we have right now, unprecedented heat waves, terrible drought across, and you've got to remember the drought is not just in the UK. Just published a piece today going look, it's this drought is Europe-wide, and they've got it a lot worse on the continent. And also look at China. It's having, again, they think it's the worst recorded drought possibly in world in recorded history. And Africa, the Horn of Africa, that people are at the point of famine because of 4 years of failed rain. So yeah, it's so bad. And then to see the kind of Tory leadership candidates both be so underwhelming, and that's putting it very lightly, on climate issues is deeply, deeply depressing. And it's odd because so many polls show that people do care about this. And that even in the kind of, the areas that the Tories are trying to reach, that, this people do want action on this. So it's befuddling as well. But yeah, it's a small group of vested interests that they're playing to.
It is truly a dire situation. So we've spoken about the political aspects of this. And I guess, to round off this overall discussion, I'm curious about, whilst obviously individual action can be very small, is there anything that you would recommend that people can do as a way to try and do their best, even though obviously climate change is an issue that is much more collective in nature, I think is fair to say?
Yeah, it's super, super collective, but even if it's just to ease your own kind of anxiety, which is so I've been Googling things I can do, and I'm very lucky I've got a bath at home. So if you've got a bath, then you can, if you take baths or you fill it up with the shower, if you have a shower, then I bought myself a plastic watering can so I can take it downstairs into and water stuff with that. And I've also been researching something called water butts, which someone told me about. So they're big containers or kind of barrels you can use, and you kind of affix them to your drain pipe. If you're in somewhere with a drain pipe that you can easily access, and that can siphon, so that fills up when it rains with and then when it doesn't rain you can use it. I did read that there was meant to be council funding to help you buy one, but I googled it. I'm living in the Camden area in London. It was very impenetrable, so I need to look. It didn't seem to be a email address, so that might have been a historic thing. I'm not quite sure that at the minute, but there should be, because one of the big problems is that when rain falls, too much of it isn't being saved and reused, and it's washing into the sewers and then or washing out to sea or wherever. So the more that we can learn, readjust to think of water as a precious resource, as I think we're starting with energy, especially with the kind of price it's got to now. People are super aware of how tricky that is to, how important it is to kind of save it, if for no other reason than you know, it's so
Yeah.
expensive. And you kind of need to start thinking of water like that as well a bit. I think I've certainly taken it for granted for most of my life in the UK. So that's something that's going to have to change.
Yeah, I think we all really have, and that is a fantastic note to end on. Everyone, do your best. And yeah, India, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a fantastic education for myself, and I'm sure for everyone watching. I would highly recommend everyone read India's articles that are in the description. There's a lot more information in there as well, and they are all amazing. And do, of course, also follow India on Twitter for all the updates about her fantastic journalism. India, thank you very much.